So one thing, though, that really interested me about the way it worked in New Hampshire was you had an awful lot of people who were not Republicans going in and voting in that primary for Nikki Haley. It was obviously a strategic vote to try and weaken his Donald Trump's vote on the night, but does it also suggest that there's an awful lot of Democrat voters out there who are really enthusiastic about stopping Trump no matter what, and will go and, do these crazy votes, or even one day maybe even vote again for Joe Biden, simply to stop Trump? Is there a does it show that there's a trouble for the Republicans in all of this?
In fact, that's exactly the trouble, James, that cost him the election in 2020. Keep in mind, in 2020, Donald Trump got, I think, at least 10 million votes more than he received in 2016 and still lost. Not only because he's a turnout machine, he absolutely is. His folks show up, but he also motivates the other side to show up to vote against him. And that's exactly what you saw here in New Hampshire. So that dynamic held true in 2020. It held true again in New Hampshire here a couple days ago. And we fully expect that to drive the outcomes in 2024 as well.
And I want to ask about, too, on the Democrat side, Joe Biden was not on the ballot. He wants to be first in South Carolina. So there was a write-in campaign. Biden did get a lot of write-in votes, but this rival candidate, Dean Phillip, did come in with around 20%. Is there a message for the Democrats about continuing uneasiness about going forward with the Joe Biden presidency?
Sure, there's messages in New Hampshire to both of the larger campaigns. The message to the Biden folks is this: is that there's roughly 20% of your Democrat voters who don't care for Joe Biden, and that's a huge number as they go into the general election in 2024. Similarly, I think 70% of Nikki Haley's voters said they wouldn't vote for Donald Trump in a general election. That's a big deal because he needs those independent voters. Those are the folks he lost in 2020 when he lost the election. Both of these leading candidates, Trump and Biden, have significant difficulties with their base. And the 2024 election is going to be outrageously close. And even small percentages of people will be able to change an outcome. So both of these folks are going to win their nominations. Joe Biden is going to be the Democrat nominee. Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. But both of them go into the general election with glaring weaknesses.
So you're holding firm on Joe Biden actually going to November, no swapping out at this stage?
It's just going to get, the longer they go into it, James, and I've talked about this both on and off the air, the longer they go into this, the harder it gets for them to change out because they lose the ability to do a primary. And it's going to look really, really bad if they hand pick a successor and not let the people decide. Plus, it would look really bad if they hand pick a successor and that successor is not the African-American female sitting vice president, Kamala Harris. So it just gets really, really sloppy the longer they go into this. Yes, they can still change the candidate as late as probably August or even September, but it gets harder and harder to do that with each passing day.
Yeah, it's a big mess. I don't envy those backroom boys at all. Now let's go forward to South Carolina here. Nikki Haley has said she's going to remain in the race despite the loss in New Hampshire. Have a look at this.
Now, you've all heard the chatter among the political class. They're falling all over themselves, saying this race is over. This race is far from over. There are dozens of states left to go. And the next one is my sweet state of South Carolina.
All right, Mick, she's South Carolina, you're South Carolina. Putting aside the very large irony of Nikki Haley talking about the political class like it's some other group of people that she's not at all a part of, what is her game in staying in this race?
Yeah, well, James, I guess count me amongst the political class who says this race is over because, as you note, I'm from South Carolina, as is Nikki. She's losing by 35 points in her sweet home state, and you just can't do that. Not only can't you do that nationally in terms of what the perception is to voters, critically, the perception of donors. She talked about the political class. Let's talk about the donor class. If she loses her home state by 35 points, the money is going to stop. And in our system, money is the lifeblood of politics. So she has a real serious problem. Personally, and the folks I talked to in South Carolina, we fully expect her to drop out before the South Carolina primary. Why? If she loses South Carolina by a huge margin, it actually hamstrings her going into 2028. It would do nothing but invigorate folks like Ron DeSantis or other potential 2028 challengers if Nikki Haley can't even win her home state or gets crushed in her home state. So there's a lot more downside, perhaps. Now, if she sees some polling data that says she's coming back in South Carolina, she's got a chance, she might stick around. But right now, the conventional wisdom amongst those in the admittedly political class is that she does not have a chance in her home state, and for that reason, she will be getting out before the end of February.
Well, there was a really interesting editorial in the Wall Street Journal, Mick, the other day that suggested that one of the reasons why she might stay in is because it's a long time to November. It's a long time even to the conventions. Donald Trump has a lot of liabilities. And she's hoping that, well, if something happens to his candidacy and he falls over and can't run, that she's there to take up the mantle. How much of that does that make sense to you?
It doesn't, because that's not how it works. Keep in mind, all these folks who have dropped out have only suspended their campaigns. Technically, they're still candidates for president. There are all sorts of legal reasons to do that. But if Nikki Haley really was the only person left on the ballot, so to speak, and Donald Trump gets struck by lightning, that doesn't mean that she's automatically the contender. Or excuse me, the nominee. What if Donald Trump comes out tomorrow and says that Tim Scott is his vice presidential nominee? There'll be tremendous pressure on the Republican National Committee to make Tim Scott the replacement for a deceased, for example, Donald Trump. So no, I read the same piece in the Wall Street Journal, a little disappointed with it. It doesn't, I think, fully grasp the process. Just because you're the only other person standing around when Donald Trump gets hit by a meteorite does not mean that you are automatically his replacement.
And congratulations, by the way, to Tim Scott on his engagement announced this week. And we'd love to get him on the program sometime if you're out there watching Tim Scott. But one final thing here, Mick Mulvaney, I want to ask you about, because you spent a lot of time with President Trump on the campaign trail, at events. And here's something I don't think is getting enough attention, and in fact, it's been barely covered. But you're seeing here on your screen video of the Secret Service swooping in to protect and cover the president after a speech that he gave where he was interrupted by pro-Hamas protesters more than a dozen times. And this made the whole event kind of a disaster as far as the speech went, but also clearly there's security concerns. How big a problem is this for his campaign if this behavior of pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine protesters keeps coming up every time Joe Biden tries to go and give an event?
It's a significant problem for a very sort of obtuse reason. So if you give me 30 seconds, I'll see if I can explain it. There's not that many Palestinian Americans who vote in these elections, okay? There's a couple million in a country of 350 million people. It's a very, very small percentage. But remember, we elect a president not nationwide, but state by state. Those Palestinian American voters, the folks who are protesting there, are concentrated in a couple of states. One of them is Michigan. There's over a million Palestinian Americans registered to vote in Michigan. That is far more than the margin of error the margin of victory in the last two elections in 2016 and 2020 in Michigan. So put it this way, if the Palestinian Americans don't vote for Joe Biden in Michigan in 2024, he would well lose Michigan. And if he loses Michigan, he probably loses the presidency. So in this particular very unusual circumstance, that very, very small sliver of Americans, and they are Americans by every measure of the word, could determine the outcome of an election. And that is a Joe Biden problem that he hasn't figured out how to deal with yet.
Absolutely fascinating. Mick Mulvaney, as always, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon again.